This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Colombia. Our very special guest this week is Walter Spurrier, who is on the line from Guayaquil in Ecuador. Walter is the president of Grupo Spurrier and an editorialist in the Diario El Universo in Ecuador. He's also the director of the political economic publication Weekly Analysis, also known in Spanish as Analisis Semanal. Welcome on the LatinNews Podcast, Walter.
Oh, thank you, Richard. I'm very pleased to be in the LatinNews Podcast.
No, it's an absolute pleasure because it's been a while since we discussed Ecuador on the podcast, but so much has been going on and, we haven't talked about it since the elections. And I think it's a good place to start before we get into all of the issues of insecurity and power outages and the economy. But if we address that second round of the presidential elections in which Noboa won by a larger margin that many of us had expected.
Yes, Richard. Actually, there are two surprises. The first surprise was in the first round. It was a tie between he and the candidate from Correísmo. And it was a surprise because polls gave him a victory or at least an important advantage to ease his way into the runoff. And he didn't. And actually, he took it very badly. He didn't make no statements afterwards. And the polls suggested that González was going to win in the runoff. That's it was going in behind the polls. However, there are a couple of things he did. And other things that the other side did, which shifted the situation. First of all, he approved he was acting president, so he approved a series of social programs that with immediate application that essentially put some money in the pocket of everybody from the lower middle class down who was not enrolled in Social Security. In other words, people did not have a regular income. And that he did and spent quite a bit of money in that. And then on the other side, information started pouring in that Correa and his team considered González just a puppet because he referred to her as Hermit the Frog in their podcast, and the government got a hold of that information. And in addition, Correa chose González as a candidate because he was absolutely sure she would be loyal to him. But in his party, in his movement, there are lots of people with a very good curriculum who were really expected to be the chosen candidate for the presidency, and they were very disappointed being relegated. So some of them probably did not campaign as hard as they were supposed to do. And in addition, in the middle class, which is particularly strong in Quito, they disliked Correa very much because of his authoritarianism and his way of having no control on his activities. His was who already analyzed things in Ecuador at the time of the military government. This was much more authoritarian than the military government we had in the 70s. So they disliked that type of government. And also, since he was a very strong president during the decade he was in power, he did not tolerate people making protests, making demonstrations in the street. So he clashed down very heavily on the indigenous movement complaints. And therefore, the indigenous felt that with Correa, they're going to be repressed if González was president. All of the things added up. And frankly, Richard, when the results of the elections will start pouring in, first I said, well, probably Noboa is ahead because the Quito votes are being polled first and coming out in the system first. But then this is going to change in time, and it did it. And I was also surprised, and no polls were predicting at that time he was going to win such an advantage. So I think these are the two factors that had the more incidence in the result. On the one hand, Noboa's spending freely to get support from the population, and on the other, mistakes made by the Correa side and resistance that on the middle classes and the indigenous people they had regarding a new Correa administration.
Actually, fascinating that again we should all stand corrected, but then that's the way these things work out. it does seem to me very interesting. Of course, the indigenous communities have that suspicion of Correísmo and the authoritarian, let's say, management employed by Correísmo. But it's a huge step for them to get behind Noboa, because you'd see them as a bit more allied, perhaps, to González's politics in that one. Even after what you said, I mean, ideologically, they're more aligned, wouldn't you say, with Luisa González?
Well, the indigenous movement is not homogeneous. On the one hand, you have the guy who took control of the indigenous movement as of late, which is Leonidas Issa, who has staged a very, very strong challenges to constitutional governments, with the last three constitutional governments, and who is a leftist. He advocates the Andean Marxism, which was started by a Peruvian indigenous political philosopher. But then most of the indigenous people are not that ideologically oriented. And you have to realize that, first of all, the Noboas have been in politics for some time. Since the father of Daniel Noboa, Alvaro, was candidate for president several times. And on 3 occasions, he won in the first round and lost in the runoff against Mawat and against Lucio Gutierrez and also against Correa. And also, during all the time that Alvaro Noboa was running for president, his wife, Anabella Azín, who is a doctor, and her father was Italian, she's tall, blonde, she worked as a doctor and had all of this social services, medical services in communities. She would go with ambulances and doctors and nurses and give medical services to poor people in the highlands and also the coast. And they loved them. I mean, Noboa has always done well in the indigenous communities because of that. So in indigenous communities, you have on the one side the people that voted with Issa in the first round, not necessarily in the second round. And then you have the other people who said Noboa has, his mother has been very kind to us. And I think this would be a very pleasant government. Mm-hmm. And then the Correa side of a very repressive regime, we should not see it only on the negative side. He tried to put order. And what the oil companies told me at the time was that before Correa, if they were sending supplies to an oil field, to the workers in an oil field, people would attack the cars, the convoys, and take away the supplies. This was the Wild West. The Wild West, and that Correa put order. So that's the other side of it. It's not only that it was an abuse, it was also putting order. And people felt they were being repressed because they could not do as they wanted. So there's two sides to Correa's repression, the positive side and the negative side. But also, as I said, the social programs from Anabella Azín, Noboa's wife, helped her son with the presidency.
It's very interesting that, the memory runs that far back, because politics tends to be so ever present in the countries in which we are located. One concern, I believe, that's coming up at the moment, and of course is threatening to undermine, would you call it the friendship or the as you say, sort of marriage of convenience between the indigenous groups and the Noboa government, is that of the National Solidarity Bill and it's the human rights concerns. Perhaps you could give us a little bit of background on this National Solidarity Bill.
Well, we always have here in Ecuador, and I notice in other countries too, every government that comes, we're concerned whether it's too authoritarian or it is too weak. In the case of the previous government we had, which is the last administration, who tried to follow the rules and try to understand and give a space to all our powers of the state, all the other branches of the state. At the end, he had to resign because it's going to be impeached for invalid reasons. The Constitutional Court and the Assembly were both against him. And Noboa tilts on the other side. So there's some concern, yes, that he is above the law because he's controlling the courts, he's moving to control the courts and to reduce the rights, to tighten his control over rights. And that's true, but on the other hand, perhaps this tilt to a slightly stronger government is necessary now. The constitution that we had under Correa, well, actually, that constitution that Correa set in 2008, and it's still the valid constitution in Ecuador now. Of course, what constitution said at the time, it didn't matter at all because we really had a dictatorship. But it tilts too much towards rights in the sense that judges close to or being bought by the criminal gangs would easily, automatically decide that criminals could be given substitute measures and go home and behave and have to show up to judges once a month and would not take any time in jail. So sometimes you get a criminal being caught in the morning, and in the evening he's shooting the police who caught him in the first place. So we've gone too much towards that side. In my particular concern, I'm really not that much concerned regarding abuses of civil rights on the presidential administration. I think once he puts some order on crime, reins crime in, I think it will be a time to start pressing for relaxing his control over the courts. Perhaps it's going to be too late, but right now we're a very violent country with criminals being not controlled at all, and the things has to change. He has to change the judges, which are close to the criminal gangs, and this law allows him to do that. But of course, there's always the danger that he would just put just men, and then he could violate civil rights.
Yeah, as you said, I mean, the weakened judicial institutions and the weakened, I guess, security institutions and so on keep this very much on the fore. I mean, it seems like a good moment to jump into the ever-present topic right now in Ecuador, of course, of security and insecurity. As you mentioned, the criminal groups, their links to the drug business, and then, of course, their infiltrations within the security forces, and I guess, judges and so on in the pockets of those. How can Ecuador possibly, or how can Noboa address this at the same time of trying to improve public security? It's all connected, but from what I've been reading and listening to, murder rates continue to be high, even despite the, let's say, almost militarization of much of the country. What is the situation right now in Guayaquil, where you are?
Well, it's very dangerous. And in general, with Noboa's claim to solve, that he's going to be able to solve the violence situation pretty soon and in a short period of time with this campaign of having the armed forces engaged in the fight against crime, I think it's going to be very difficult for him to meet this goal, because the violence has not been solved in Colombia, has not been solved in Mexico, has not been solved in Rio de Janeiro. And I mentioned Rio, not Brazil, because in Brazil, security matters are handled by states. It really works like a federal country, Brazil, which it is. And then the reason why we have so much crime in Ecuador is since Ecuador is the world's largest exporter of bananas. Bananas is a cheap product and makes a huge volume of exports to the point that the Guayaquil ports handle as much cargo, as much containerized cargo as Lima's port, Callao, being Peru more than double the size of Ecuador. And so it's very easy to hide drugs inside the banana shipments. So that's the reason why Mexican and Colombian cartels agreed to send some of their connections to and through Ecuadorian ports. In addition, this was helped by Correa, who brought in FARC into Ecuador and brought the local gangs, brought them into his government. And so right now, to do away with criminal activities, it's going to be very difficult. Criminal activity has very different compartments. One is fight between cartels for control. And we do have that. And a lot of the people who died are fights, inter-gang fights, and also the innocent bystanders. Like if you go on and shoot people at a cafe, some people get killed, or kill somebody who's walking on the street. They also hit bystanders. That's one crime. Also, the clampdown on the drug trade means that these local gangs that have been organized by the Colombian and Mexican cartels also try to get more money out of the local population and start extortion rackets. And it's spreading, and that's very difficult to control. It's not only extortion rackets regarding big business, it's extortion rackets regarding poor people. For instance, a taxi driver, I used to get his services whenever I have to go someplace, which was too much traffic to go there, and I didn't want to be driving and seeing where to park and so on and so forth. He was shot a month ago, and while he was waiting for his wife to come out from a medical facility. And the reason is that he had not accepted to pay, to be extorted. They were asking him to pay so much a week to them for as an extortion. The gangs that looked for him, he refused, so they shot him. And so we do also have that other crime. So things are very dangerous in Guayaquil, and people tend to restrain themselves to go out in areas which they feel comfortable in. And yes, it's one of the most dangerous cities in Latin America right now. And we're all very concerned. And we don't see yet how the government is going to be able to control that. And it's very hard for us to evaluate what the government is doing to know how successful it's going to be. Now, with this new law, and if this means that now he's going to be able to grab criminals and put them in jail, and he's building a higher security jail to be able to have these criminals, to stop these people from controlling their gangs from jail as they do presently, perhaps he's going to have some success. But so far, I don't think he has had much success. This year is more violent than last year.
Well, it is his first full term. It's his first full term. There's still a significant period of time, but again, the figures are very much a concern. The day-to-day life for everyone, Guayaquil in Ecuador, very much a concern. And when we talk about the successful nature of militarization and campaigns, there are so many different factors to bring in. And you'd say that the recent capture of the leader Fito he escaped in January 2024 and was captured, I guess it was a couple of weeks ago, so late June or early July 2025. I mean, that was it was billed as a huge success, but of course it was an embarrassment that he got out. And this event overshadowed, of course, the escape of the leader Fede from El Litoral prison. So we sort of 3 steps forwards, 2 steps back, and then we come back to that issue of the deep penetration of the illegal groups and the gangs into all of the different institutions. And so President Noboa is facing some serious challenges on this front. I mean, talk about a need to overhaul and really weed out corrupt elements within this. Do we even see this as possible?
Well, we have 2 goals which are sometimes at odds. One is fight against crime, and the other have support for his policy against crime. And at first, this may seem to be 2 things that go together, and that's not so. For instance, capturing Fito is a success for the president in terms of the support of the population. He's doing something. He's caught this big fish. He caught him, and he's probably going to deport him to the U.S. But I mean, these people are not the geniuses behind crime. They are just cogs in a wheel. And Fito got there because his predecessors were shot. There are other people that are ready to get into his shoes. And in addition, probably there are 2 or 3 people who want that position in the tornadoes which he had. And therefore, we're going to have more violence within a gang, between factions of the gang, to see who gets control of the network and gets all the money Fito was getting. So in terms of actual success against gangs, I don't think this is much of a victory. It's mainly a public relations victory. And in addition, there is, I cover very many different topics. We've mentioned welfare and very many different topics, but I'm not necessarily an expert on them. There is a political scientist, Benjamin Lessing, who has studied the case of Colombia, Mexico, and Rio in particular, the 3 cases. And he claims that there are 3 goals which are very difficult to have success in simultaneously. One is to end violence, second is to end corruption, and third to end the drug business. He says it's impossible. You have to settle for one. And the first one you have to settle is to control violence. And he says what you should do is have a conditional policy towards gangs, saying if you get into violence, we're going to repress you. But others that are just into drug dealings, we're going to be more lenient with those, because our first goal is to control crime, control violence. And but that's not necessarily popular, because people would say they're doing nothing. They're not getting people in jail. They're not killing criminals. And in the end, that policy, governments have used that policy, had to abandon it. So I think this is going to take a long time to solve. And this, yes, as you surmise, if he really does not clamp down in violence enough, and this keeps dragging on, that may mean that he would lose his popularity. So I think it's a main challenge he's facing towards his success in this administration.
That's right. I mean, he stands or falls on the security issue. Let's talk about other things that are occurring in Ecuador, and we focus a lot on the indigenous issues. We focused a lot, obviously, on security. All of these things do tether in together with everything that's going on in Ecuador. A major concern to the people are these massive power outages taking place. Perhaps you could explain a little what's going on there, please.
Yes, the first point is that ever since the military came to power in the early 70s, at the time, the economic policy that was the consensus in Latin America was import substitution and a huge role for the state. At the time, a lot of people around the world felt that communist-style socialism was going to be what's coming next into the world, that everybody was moving into that situation. And then we've had a very dominant situation of the state in the economy. And of course, the military took over in the early 70s, Ecuador started producing oil. And then when Correa came in, which is very much the same viewpoints, we also had a new increase in oil production. So it came out of a constitution that essentially say the state is going to build power generations, and it's going to do it out of its own revenues, and costs of power generation are going to be passed to the public. So as if we're going to live forever on an economy running on oil revenues, and that stopped less than 10 years after the constitution was approved. So what he did at the time is spend a lot of money. I mean, actually, he took a lot of debt with China to have power stations built, and most are on the Amazon range. In other words, the Andes look and search the Amazon. And so he would say Ecuador is one of the countries in the world that needs less thermal electricity. It's mostly hydropower. We're being green. Now, first of all, those hydro plants, many of them have huge problems. And secondly, looking towards the Amazon, it has a rain system in which during 6 months of the year, they have very heavy rains. The 6 months they don't have rain at all. So when they don't have rain at all, these are not power stations that have huge dams, huge reservoirs. They mainly administrate the water that flows from the river. So when you have a dry season, generation falls terribly. And when you are in the high season, when you have a lot of rains, it rains so much that water comes murky, it's muddy waters that clogs the power generation. So they have to stop generation to clean the station, so the muddy waters won't hurt the engine. So it was a very bad idea to depend on this kind of electricity. So that's the situation we have now. And all the thermal power that we had at the time, they didn't build any new thermal units. So thermal units were built in the 70s. So very obsolete thermal units in very bad shape. So the Ecuador has been trying to solve this problem, but then they cannot ask for power companies to come in and build power stations, as they have in Colombia, for instance, because the law requires that this station, any private generator, has to sell to the state. Now, the state power company owns the utilities, and the utilities have the tariffs have a very low rate for low-income consumers, so that they work at a loss. And so they don't pay to the state power generation company. So if a private power generation comes in, they have to sell to clients that won't pay them back. So you don't have private investment because of that. They say, we need some kind of guarantee from the government that we're going to get paid. The government would pay if the utilities don't pay. So they haven't solved that problem yet. So it all depends on the government contracting new power units, and the government procurement process is slow, it's inefficient, and so we are running behind installing enough power generation to meet our needs. What the government has decided, on the one hand, is because the government says we're not going to have blackouts anymore, which I think we're going to have blackouts. But what the government is going to do is, first of all, is relying that the needs for new power generation have partially been met. We don't have as much. The problem is not going to be as serious as it was last year. But what he's going to do is going to cut power to business. It's not going to basically to manufacturing companies, to huge consumers. It's not going to cut generation he's not going to cut energy towards your residential use, so it won't affect him on his popularity front. He would still remain popular, but that's going to hurt the economy. So this is an issue we have right now, and he wants business to build their own generating plants. But that's a huge problem, because he wants them to build generating plants for their own use, but which they can only use whenever they're not being sold energy by the state, not being supplied energy by the state, which is a very inefficient system. So we still have a huge problem, but it's now more concentrated on business more than on residential consumers.
It's hard for me to get my head around all of that you just said, and the complications of trying to untangle this. This is a multi-generational issue that will need to be addressed, not just by President Noboa, but several successors to President Noboa, and him cutting back. I can understand the popularity side of things. It's great optics not cutting power to people, but cutting to business and affecting the economy. There are major challenges presently and ahead for Ecuador. They've got a big budget deficit, huge debt obligations. Fiscal austerity measures have been agreed with the IMF. This issue with the power generation doesn't look entirely positive.
Yes, it doesn't. What they have to do, this is what I've been arguing, is they have to repeal this idea of a state monopoly on the energy sector, which is not only on power sector, it's also in oil. And because then you're going to have international power companies coming into Ecuador, talking to business, signing contracts, having secured a market, and come in and build new power units. And you could have solved the problem in a couple of years that way. But you have to have that solution. And the government still has not moved in that direction. It's been addressing other matters such as security issues, but has not addressed the problem of how to allow private investment in power generation and in transmission. He has to address that issue. He still hasn't. And the other side of the problem is that this government doesn't give much information out. This is the time in which I have been the least sources within the administration of what they're really thinking they're going to do. So in that sense, we don't know if he is ready to open up power generation for private investment. If he does, he can solve the problem pretty easily, relatively few years. But otherwise, this is going to continue and drag on for a long time.
This is where I see it all coming together. And sadly, the power generation not being resolved. There's no information from the government. Maybe they don't have a plan. Hopefully there is some sort of plan. The power generation failing to be solved, the economy due to businesses being hit by this, leading to an instability socially, and that feeding more into the insecurity in the country. All of these points do come together. Walter, how do you see the next 6 months to a year in Ecuador?
Well, we're going to have a short-lived improvement on the economy. On the one hand, business is much relieved by the fact that Noboa won the election. After all, his family owns one of the largest business groups in Ecuador. It's a banana grower. Definitely, he's not going to follow anti-business policies. He may follow policies or take measures that business won't like, but not anti-business by any means. And so they may be looking towards increasing investment, private investment in their businesses, whatever they need in their businesses. If González had won the election, we would have capital flight, a substantial capital flight, and this is not happening. Since the banks were readying towards a possibility of González winning the election and starting to issuing fake dollars, which is what they planned to do, and also shutting down the economy, banks were building reserves. They were trying to be very liquid, just in case you had a run on deposits, and therefore they could stand an adverse economic and political situation. Right now, banks find themselves with a lot of funds in which they're paying interest on, in which they have sitting in their coffers, and they don't need to have so much liquidity at the time. So they are searching for businesses and consumers to take loans. So you have if you want to invest, banks will come to you and offer you money to invest. In other words, we do not have a financial problem from that standpoint. Then the money that the government is spread among lower income people, they went out and start buying foodstuff, buying cheap goods and services, and that has come into the economy. And also, private exports are doing quite well. Of course, most of all, cocoa business, which is very high prices of cocoa. Ecuador is the third largest exporter of cocoa in the world, which is far behind the two African countries that are first and second. But still, cocoa exports now are on the same level than banana exports. And also we had a boom in shrimp exports. So Ecuador's non-oil exports are doing quite well. And that money has come into the economy. We have substantial reserves in the banks for all the money from oil exports. So this is going to get into the economy. We're going to have some improvement in the economy in the short time, in the short while. But we're still missing an economic growth policy in terms of the government. The government is still trying to be in good terms with IMF, because IMF has been supporting the economic program with the loans. And so all economic measures so far have been geared to improving the budget situation. So either measures to improve tax control, to tax payments, but they're also about to issue a new tax legislation. So we're going to have an increase in taxes probably. This will be sent this year to Congress, which President controls totally. And this is going to be new tax measures for next year. So and what the government is aiming is for country risk to fall far enough so that he could issue new bonds in the international market. New bonds, not so much to increase debt, but to be able to roll over our debt in international markets. Our chief debt problem is that the bonds are coming due, and the international markets don't want more Ecuadorian bonds. So he has to do something similar in its aims, not on its policies, what Milei is doing in Argentina, to get Argentina back in the international market. That was he's striving for now. But so far, he's improving the government's budget situation, but it's mainly at the expense of business expenditures, which is growing. And therefore, this is not helping the government to grow, because essentially the budget problem, the long-term solution is having economic growth. If you have economic growth, you're going to be able to have more revenues without increasing taxes. And this is we're not achieving. We're so far achieving more money coming into the government from the economy, so we can attend our public debt, mainly it's external debt, and that means essentially taking money out of the local economy to pay foreigners. So this doesn't help economic growth. So it's a current situation. And this is a new administration after all. It was just preparing for this new period during the time he was finishing last year's period. But the midterm goal, Ecuadorian economy's perspectives of a midterm are not much more than 2.5% of economic growth a year, which is too low. But in the short time, in the next 6 months, we could have it slightly better because of the conditions I just mentioned.
Short-term positive, long-term concern, I think we could put that down. Walter, thank you so much for your time. I think we'll bring this to an end here. We've covered so much of what's going on in Ecuador and looking at the key issues of the economy, power outages, the indigenous, let's say, concerns, and of course, insecurity in Ecuador. This has been the LatinNews Podcast. I've been Richard McCall, talking to Walter Spurrier, who is an economic analyst. He's got a background in political science, director of the Political Economic Report Weekly Analysis, or Analisis Semanal. Is also an editorialist for the Diario El Universo in Ecuador. Thank you so much for your time and sharing what seems to be in the knowledge without end on Ecuador.
Thank you very much, Richard, and hello to everybody linked to the Latin Post.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Remember, we'll be back in a couple of weeks' time discussing further topics from the region with experts in their fields. Bye-bye.